Hello, I'm Robert Hyland. The first thing I want to do is apologize for not being able to be there with you today. I'm afraid I'm doing some recruiting, so thank you to Sarah for playing this video for you. And I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the film you're going to watch today, which is Pride and Prejudice. Now, Pride and Prejudice, the film, is the most recent Hollywood adaptation of a novel by Jane Austen written in the early 19th century. The film that you're going to watch today was made in 2005, starring Keira Knightley, who most of you will recognize from the Pirates of the Caribbean film. This is the second major filmed adaptation of this novel. The first was in the 1990s with Colin Firth playing the character Mr. Darcy. Now that was a 5-hour series. Today's film is not 5 hours, it's a 2-hour version. And this version reduces the story to a love story between Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. The story is essentially about how you realize you're in love. Is love something that comes quickly and makes your heart flutter and feels very intense? Or is love something different? Is it something that lasts longer? Is it something to do with respect? Is it to do with social class and position? These are all questions that the novel takes pains to answer, but the film reduces to plot points. Although you still get a certain feeling of these issues in the film. Now the film tells essentially the story of the Bennet family. The Bennet family is comprised of Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet. Together they've had 5 daughters and no sons. Now Mr. Bennet is very detached from the daily concerns of his daughters. He doesn't really understand them. They're girls, and he's not a girl. And they have interests in things that interest girls, dressing, partying. And so he's very detached from his daughters. That doesn't mean he doesn't love them. He loves his daughters very much. But he's not that concerned about their daily lives. He's very concerned about their happiness and their well-being, but he doesn't really understand what girls think. That is, he doesn't really understand what his daughters think, except Elizabeth, who's his favorite. And Elizabeth is his favorite because she's very smart, and he values information. So that leaves the daughters under the care of their mother, Mrs. Bennet. Now, Mrs. Bennet has one major concern, and that's to make sure that all of her daughters get successfully married. And when I say successfully married, I mean married to people who are wealthy. Now, this should prove quite easy for her eldest daughter, Jane. Jane is very beautiful. She's the most beautiful of the Bennet sisters. So Mr. and Mrs. Bennet have one major concern, and that's to make sure that their 5 daughters are successfully married. They have 5 daughters: Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. Now, the story really revolves around Elizabeth, the second daughter. Now, Jane is the most beautiful, and she should get married the easiest. Elizabeth is the second oldest, the second most beautiful, but she makes up for her lack in beauty with a very sharp wit. She's a very intelligent young woman. So Jane meets a man named Mr. Bingley, and he's very rich. And he becomes quite interested in her, and Jane is convinced that they will get married. Jane is then approached by Mr. Collins, and Mr. Collins also asks Jane to marry him. But Jane says no, because she thinks she will marry Mr. Bingley. Now Mr. Collins will inherit the house that Jane, Elizabeth, and her sisters grew up in, and he thinks that that makes him a suitable candidate to marry. So after Jane refuses Mr. Collins then asks the second sister, Elizabeth, if she would like to marry him. And Elizabeth again says no. Elizabeth, in the meantime, meets Mr. Bingley's friend, Mr. Darcy, and she becomes kind of interested in Mr. Darcy, but she thinks Mr. Darcy is very rude. He's very arrogant or very proud, and Elizabeth doesn't like this. She then later meets a different man, Mr. Wicks, and she finds him very attractive. He's a member of the army. He has a reasonable amount of money, it should seem, and he's very charming and very handsome. And so Elizabeth becomes very interested in this. Jane, who is in love with Mr. Bingley, is very shy around men and very quiet. Mr. Bingley's sister dislikes Jane's family. She doesn't think they are rich enough. Mr. Bingley's friend, Mr. Darcy, convinces Bingley that Jane isn't interested enough in Mr. Bingley, and that he should go back to London and try and find another wife. This leaves Jane very sad. Elizabeth later finds out that Mr. Darcy had told his friend not to marry Jane, and Elizabeth feels that Mr. Darcy is a terrible man for doing that. Broke her sister's heart. And so she has a very big fight with Mr. Darcy. And then Darcy explains why he told his friend not to marry Jane. And he explains that he didn't think Jane was interested in him. He misread her. And he was trying to protect his friend. And Elizabeth can kind of accept that. But she still doesn't think a great deal of Mr. Darcy. But Mr. Darcy confesses that he loves Elizabeth. He's very madly in love. He's a very shy man, and he has difficulty talking. But he confesses that he loves Elizabeth. And Elizabeth rejects him. Later, she receives a letter from Mr. Darcy explaining his position on several different things. And his letter is very well written. It shows he is charming. And she meets Mr. Darcy again, and she discovers that he is maybe someone different from what she thought. So we have Elizabeth now, who is falling in love with Mr. Darcy. Mr. Darcy is very quiet, very shy, but is trying his best to do the right thing. We have Jane, who's in love with Mr. Bingley, and Mr. Bingley comes back to marry Jane, and Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy in the end finally get married. So we have three weddings in the end. We have a marriage between Lydia and Mr. Wicks, which starts off troublesome, but ends up being good. We have a marriage between Jane and Mr. Bingley, and we have a marriage between Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. And the story is mostly centered around Elizabeth. But Mr. and Mrs. Bennet's wish, which is to marry all their daughters, becomes fulfilled, and three of their daughters